The 1960s. Every channel on the TV had some sort of cheesy comedy ripe with ill-timed laugh tracks and poorly executed jokes. But there was one comedy series that dared to stand out from the rest. Hogan's Heroes. It was a CBS series loosely based on popular World War II movies like The Great Escape, during which a colorful cast of American prisoners of war would constantly outsmart the leaders of the Third Reich. It may sound like there wouldn't be that far a series like this could go, but the writers and producers managed to string this concept out for a whopping 6 seasons, making almost everyone involved in the show a huge success. But very few of them were quite as successful as the show's top dog, Bob Crane. Bob played Colonel Robert Hogan, the leader of this ragtag team of inmates who was always popular with the ladies. And for Bob Crane, playing Colonel Robert Hogan was the highlight of his career. Bob had first started out in the military, and then as a radio host on The Bob Crane Show. There he mingled with celebrities and rubbed shoulders with producers, which got him interviews with some of the top names in the industry at the time. Marilyn Monroe, Bob Hope, Charlton Heston all appeared on Bob's show. But it was when he interviewed TV writer Carl Reiner that his luck really turned around. Carl Reiner offered Bob Crane a part on The Dick Van Dyke Show. It was only a one-off deal where Bob would play the role of a cheating husband, but it did get Bob a foot in the door. After proving that he had acting skills to do the job, Bob was offered a permanent role playing a dentist on The Donna Reed Show. It was then, with his fame building and his star rising, that Bob's agent came across the script for Hogan's Heroes and passed it along to Bob. He initially hated the script. Up until then, he'd strictly been involved in comedic acting roles, and he had no intentions of acting in a serious drama based on serious world history events like the World Wars and the Third Reich. Bob's son Robert, later writing about his father, said that his agent then managed to turn Bob's perception of the series around. Quote, "Bob, what are you talking about? This is a comedy. These are the funny Nazis." Many would forgive Bob for being confused about the tone of the series. World War II had only ended 20 years before he was sitting there reading the manuscripts for Hogan's Heroes. For most people, the war and the hardships that came with it were still within living memory, and that was definitely true for the cast. Many of them were Jewish. Some of them had lost friends and loved ones during the war and the prison camps. Some of them had been real prisoners of war themselves and still had the tattoos to prove it. It was a real concern that making a lighthearted, comedic series about such a tragic and difficult time was too much, too soon. But Bob and his other castmates took a huge leap of faith, and it paid off. Hogan's Heroes was an overnight sensation, and Bob Crane became a bona fide Hollywood star. Money, fame, and notoriety gave Bob everything he wanted right at his fingertips, and it allowed him to indulge in his biggest vice: women. Bob absolutely loved women. So much so that looking at it from today's 2024 perspective, you could assume that Bob was a sex addict. He collected pictures of women, especially the ones he had sexual relationships with. He was already married to his high school sweetheart, Ann Terzian, and had 3 children with her, but that did not stop him. With his newfound fame and success, women began throwing themselves at Bob, and Bob found that he couldn't say no. He stored his growing pile of nude pictures and pornography in his home, in his car, and in his changing room at work, where he was known to take them out and show them to his co-stars. There were no drugs, no coercion, none like that, his son Robert explained. Women just liked him, or found him handsome, or whatever it was. They would hook up. But the truth was that Bob and these women were doing a bit more than just that. Along the way, Bob made friends with John Carpenter. John was a video equipment salesman who worked at Sony, and he opened Bob's eyes to the world of homemade pornography. After that, Bob was hooked. He purchased anything and everything that he would need to start making his own videos to add to his growing collection. Bob and John often worked together. They would go out on the town, using Bob's new fame to attract beautiful women, and then they would take them back to a room where they would film themselves in the act long into the night. Bob kept all of these videos and paraded his conquests to those around him. But there were those who claimed that making porno films was not actually Bob's main goal in all of this. Carol Ford later wrote in a biography about Bob, quote, "As far as the amateur pornography, that was a small part of the bigger pie, you might say. Bob was chronicling and writing down and filming every single thing in his life. So when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, it's just a small slice." But collecting pornography and sharing pictures of women that he'd slept with was about to catch up with Bob. He made some bad moves. Robert later explained he collected photographs of women and put together these books. Oh, here's Sally from Jacksonville, Florida. And then he started showing them off to people. He was doing a very bad Disney movie called Super Dad, playing an all-American character who cares about his daughter running off with some unsavory type. But at Disney Studios in Burbank, he's on the set showing photos of women that he's been with to people on the crew. That hurt him because the executives found out. People talk, and it started getting in publications like the National Enquirer. At that point, the cat was out of the bag, and Bob's star began to diminish. But far from realizing what was happening to him, Bob was enjoying himself. He even took his then 21-year-old son, Robert, to the 1972 premiere of Deep Throat. He just loved it because he was meeting all these porn stars, Robert later wrote. But Bob Crane now had a sullied reputation, and Hogan's Heroes, the very show that had brought him fame in the first place, had just aired its final episode. Bob was officially now out of work, and instead of landing another gig in Hollywood, he found himself working the dinner theater circuit. Cameras and big studio buildings with hundreds of cast and crew had been replaced with live performances in restaurants for the average citizen. He then moved to Phoenix, where he bought the rights and performed a romantic comedy play called Beginner's Luck, and places like The Windmill. His marriage with Anne was long dead and buried, and now his second marriage with Patricia Olson looked like it too was about to come crashing down. He'd been a huge star. He'd been rich and famous, and he'd had it all, but somehow it all slipped through his fingers. Ahead of him laid a life of grinding and clamoring to get back to the heights he'd once flown. And Bob knew that in order to do that, he needed to reevaluate his life. Just before his birthday, Bob called his son and told him his plan. Quote, he was 2 weeks shy of 50. He says, "I'm making changes. I'm divorcing Patty." He wanted to lose those people like John Carpenter who had become a pain in the butt. He wanted a clean slate. They had a breakup of sorts. Carpenter lost it. He was being rejected. He was being spurned like a lover. There are eyewitnesses that night at the club in Scottsdale that said they had an argument, John and my dad. End quote. What Robert was referring to was an incident that happened right before tragedy would strike. In June 1978, Bob's co-star Victoria Ann Berry walked into Bob's apartment after he'd failed to show up for a lunch meeting. There, she found him beaten, his face an unrecognizable mess, and his bedsheets sodden with blood. Bob was dead, and within hours, his son Robert was being escorted onto the scene of his father's murder to help with the investigation. The Scottsdale Police Department didn't actually have a homicide unit at the time, a fact that Robert would later say greatly hindered the investigation. Vaughn, Bob's business manager, Goldstein, his lawyer, and I walked through the apartment, examining, touching, handling items in plain view of Vassal, the lead detective on the case. We added our fingerprints, footprints, and hair samples to an already contaminated, lackadaisically investigated, casually considered murder scene. Detective Barry Vassal, or Vassal, would later deny that Bob's crime scene had been handled incorrectly, especially because he believed that they had their man, John Carpenter. The two of them had noticeably fought in the days before the murder, and there had been no signs of forced entry at the scene, suggesting that Bob had known his attacker. We found blood in Carpenter's rental car and on the passenger door. Barry later said it was Crane's blood type. Nobody else who handled the car had the same type as Crane. DNA technology was severely lacking at that time, so blood typing was as far as the investigators could go in terms of collecting forensic evidence. But it wasn't enough to persuade the county attorney to prosecute John. It wasn't until 12 years later that John was charged with the murder of Bob Crane, and by then, most of the physical evidence had already been destroyed. The last of the forensic samples taken from the scene had also been destroyed in the attempt to get a more conclusive DNA profile, and those attempts had been made in vain. The prosecution had very little evidence to prove that John Carpenter had killed Bob Crane, and he was acquitted. He actually died 4 years later and took anything that he knew with him to the grave. Robert, who initially believed that John was his father's killer, has since pointed the finger elsewhere, at his stepmother, Patricia Olson. Quote, "She was in the middle of a divorce with my dad. If there's no divorce, she keeps what she gets, and if there's no husband, she gets the whole thing." Robert claims that Patricia was never properly investigated, and now she never will be. She died of lung cancer in 2007, also taking any secrets that she was keeping with her. "I don't know what else to do," Robert said. "Carpenter's dead, Patty's dead. Time is just taking people away." That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast today. If you're a new listener, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts, and that could be several places. I know personally, I have an iPhone, so I have Apple Podcasts. I also have a Spotify subscription, so between those two, I subscribe to a bunch of different podcasts, and the same ones on each one just depends on where I am and what I'm doing. Sometimes one app is easier to use in different places. You know how it works. So wherever you like to listen to podcasts, make sure you hit subscribe on 10-Minute Murder. And if you've got a question or a comment, anything that you want to get in touch with me about, joe@10minutemurder.com. And this one is from Casey in Austin. Joe, what is a conspiracy theory that you do believe? And what is one that you do not believe? Okay, this is a good question. The first part is going to be, whatever, but the second part you may think is a little controversial. I don't, but it could be interpreted that way. I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald had help in his assassination of John F. Kennedy. I do think he was heavily involved and definitely did fire shots, but he had help in some way. In what way, I'm not sure, but I think he had help. So that's the one that I do believe. The one that I do not believe, the conspiracy theory that I do not believe, is that Venezuelan street gangs have taken over an apartment complex in Aurora, Colorado. That one's way more recent. I read where people think that the Hells Angels motorcycle club was en route to handle it because the police couldn't handle it. This isn't true. It's a situation of a deadbeat property management group with a laundry list of code violations making the property unsafe, mixed with some xenophobia. The local news there has reported on this. If you see your friends posting on Instaface about this, trying to drum up hate and fear of immigrants, just trying to live their lives, please don't believe that, because that is not true. There's definitely some stuff happening there, but it's not the thing you think it is if you think it's a Venezuelan street gang and there's a motorbike club headed to handle the situation. It's not that. All right, that's it. That is your episode for today. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder.